In the cold, fog-laden streets of London, whispers traveled faster than the wind. England was a kingdom at the crossroads of history, burdened by factional strife, political intrigue, and the heavy weight of expectation. And in this turbulent age, a young prince emerged, Henry of England, heir to the throne, just 27 years old, carrying the dreams of a nation on his shoulders. Few believed in his youth, fewer still in his courage, yet the destiny of a kingdom would be forever altered by his resolve. Henry V was not born to legend, he would become one. From the royal halls of Westminster to the battlefields of France, his life would be a testament to ambition, strategy, and the raw courage of a king who refused to yield. Imagine the tension in the corridors of power, lords scheming, advisors plotting, and a young prince sharpening his mind and his blade, knowing that one misstep could plunge the nation into chaos. It was in these crucibles of politics and preparation that Henry forged the qualities that would one day lead to the miraculous victory at Agincourt. Across the English Channel, France was a land of opulence, arrogance, and underestimation. A kingdom powerful, yet fractured, watching England with suspicion and, in many quarters, disdain. Yet, history favors the bold. Against overwhelming odds, Henry would rally a weary army, inspire loyalty in men far older and more experienced, and confront a French force many times larger than his own. This was more than a battle. It was a test of leadership, courage, and the unyielding human spirit. In this cinematic journey, you will witness the rise of a young king, the tension of diplomacy teetering on the edge of war, the brutality and heroism of medieval combat, and the enduring legacy of one man whose courage changed the course of history. From the quiet reflection of royal chambers to the muddy fields of Agincourt, from whispered council plots to the thunder of arrows across the sky, the story of Henry V is a story of audacity, strategy, and destiny. If you are ready to experience history as it was meant to be told visually, emotionally, and with the full weight of cinematic storytelling, then immerse yourself in the world of Henry V. Witness the triumphs, the perils, and the miracle that would echo across centuries. Like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to journey further into the stories that shaped our world. The chill of an English dawn crept through the narrow streets of London, curling around timbered houses and the stone walls of Westminster. Mist hung over the Thames, its waters gray and restless, mirroring the uncertainty that gripped the kingdom. England, still recovering from decades of civil unrest, was a nation poised on the edge of change. And at the heart of this fragile realm stood a young Prince Henry, son of Henry IV, Prince of Wales, the future king whose very presence carried the weight of expectation and the burden of legacy. Henry's youth was both a blessing and a peril. At 26, his frame was lean but strong, trained not only in the art of combat but in diplomacy, rhetoric, and the subtle nuances of power. Yet in the courts and councils of England, youth was often equated with inexperience and experience with caution. The prince knew that he would be judged harshly, that every decision, every glance, every word could ripple through the halls of power and beyond. The eyes of the nobility watched him, some with hope, others with envy or suspicion. Each meeting, each council, each audience was a test of character and resolve. The streets themselves reflected the duality of the kingdom. Merchants called out from their stalls, hawking textiles, salt, and ale, while beggars pressed their hands into the cold stone, waiting for charity. Knights in polished armor made their way to the courts, banners fluttering in the crisp morning air, a silent reminder of England's long history of war and conquest. Within these same streets, young Henry would walk, observing not just the faces of his people, but the pulse of the nation itself. He knew that the strength of a king lay not merely in his sword arm, but in understanding the hearts of those he ruled. Inside the royal chambers, the weight of succession was ever present. Henry's father, King Henry IV, had fought to seize the throne, quelling rebellions and securing fragile loyalties, though the elder king's reign had stabilized England in many ways. Unrest still lingered like a shadow over the court. Factions vied for influence, and whispers of conspiracy echoed through stone corridors and candlelit halls. It was here that the prince learned to navigate treacherous waters, balancing loyalty with suspicion, power with prudence. Cinematically, one could imagine Henry in the dim glow of a chamber, practicing sword forms in silence, the rhythm of metal on wood, a meditation on discipline. Advisors and courtiers hovered nearby, their faces unreadable, offering counsel that was equal parts guidance and subtle manipulation. Every gesture, every word, was scrutinized. Henry learned to discern truth from flattery, to measure ambition against loyalty, to cultivate a presence that commanded respect despite his age. Education, too, was a battlefield of its own. Tutors spoke of history, law, Latin, and the classics, pressing upon him the lessons of kings who had risen and fallen, of nations that had prospered and collapsed. Henry absorbed these lessons not as rote memorization but as the building blocks of wisdom, each story a cautionary tale, each strategy a potential template for the trials to come. He understood that to be a king was to inhabit multiple roles at once: warrior, diplomat, judge, and sometimes even actor, performing a part that satisfied the expectations of nobles, clergy, and commoners alike. And yet, in the quiet moments, Henry was still a man of his age. He could ride swiftly through the fields, sword in hand, laughing with companions, the wind whipping through his hair. These moments, fleeting as they were, reminded him of the humanity that underpinned his duty, the laughter, the camaraderie, the loyalty of friends who would one day march with him into history. It was this balance between the relentless demands of power and the simple truths of human connection that forged his character. Beyond the walls of London, the political landscape stretched into a tapestry of challenges and opportunity. France, with its sprawling territories and complex claims, waited as both rival and prize. Scotland and Ireland presented intermittent threats, while domestic lords tested the young prince's patience and authority. Henry knew that to inherit the crown would be to inherit these problems in full, that he must prepare not only for ceremony but for the harsh realities of kingship. Every decision would carry consequences, and the lessons of youth would shape the man who would lead England to destiny. And so, the young prince honed his mind as rigorously as his body. He watched, he listened, he learned. The halls of Westminster, the echoing streets of London, and the distant whispers from across the Channel formed a crucible in which Henry's courage, wisdom, and resolve were tested. In the days to come, he would confront challenges that would define not just his reign but the very identity of England itself. The morning mist lifts over the Thames, revealing a city alive with possibility and peril. His eyes are steady, his jaw set, and in that moment, the weight of the crown presses lightly upon him, not as a burden, but as a promise. The coronation of Henry V was both a moment of triumph and the beginning of relentless scrutiny. The streets of London were alive with banners, the chants of citizens, and the clang of church bells. Yet beneath the festive exterior, every gesture, every bow, and every proclamation was observed, measured, and weighed. England's nobles, accustomed to intrigue and ambition, watched with calculating eyes. Would this young king, inexperienced yet determined, rise to the occasion or falter under the immense responsibilities thrust upon him? Henry understood that appearances were often as powerful as deeds. The ceremony, rich with pageantry, was more than tradition. It was a signal to allies and rivals alike. He wore the crown not merely as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of the delicate balance he now must maintain. Authority demanded strength, but wisdom demanded patience. And in this early stage of his reign, every decision could either consolidate power or invite rebellion. Yet Henry's strength was not purely ceremonial. The young king was deliberate, methodical, and perceptive. He convened councils with advisors drawn from diverse factions, assessing loyalties and motivations with an acuity that belied his years. Within these chambers, Henry displayed both intellect and intuition, questioning strategies, weighing consequences, and sometimes allowing silence to convey his judgment. It was in these moments of quiet observation that he earned the respect of cautious lords and wary officials alike. Outside the walls of Westminster, the kingdom itself was a tapestry of tensions. Northern counties remembered rebellions from Henry IV's reign, while southern nobles tested the limits of royal authority. England's coffers were strained, yet the ambitions of a king demanded funds for defense, diplomacy, and eventually, conquest. Henry's early reign required mastery not only of swords and armies, but of coin, contracts, and the subtle art of negotiation. Every treaty signed, every tax levied, every decree issued was a thread in the delicate web of statecraft he was weaving. Cinematically, one might picture Henry pacing the council chamber late at night, candlelight flickering against ancient stone, maps and ledgers spread across the table. His advisors debated fiercely, presenting conflicting visions for foreign and domestic policy. Yet Henry listened, weighed, and made decisions that reflected both courage and prudence. His voice, measured but firm, conveyed authority without arrogance, inspiring confidence in allies and caution in adversaries. Beyond politics, the personal demands of kingship pressed heavily. Henry was acutely aware of the legacy of his father, a king who had seized power through rebellion, whose reign had been marked by civil conflict and unrest. The young king inherited both triumph and vulnerability, understanding that the perception of weakness could invite chaos, yet that excessive force could alienate those whose loyalty he required. He learned to navigate these paradoxes with careful calculation, blending diplomacy with decisive action. Amid these trials, Henry's military training remained essential. He often rode with knights, practicing tactics, drilling in formations, and honing his own skill with the sword and bow. To lead a kingdom, he knew, one must first command respect on the battlefield. Soldiers respected a king who understood their hardships, who had shared their fatigue, and who could inspire courage in the darkest hours. These excursions were not mere sport. They were a crucible in which the young prince tested both body and mind. Cultural and religious authority also played a role in shaping his early reign. Henry recognized the power of the church not merely as a spiritual institution, but as a pillar of political legitimacy. Chapels, monasteries, and clerics were both allies and instruments, and the young king cultivated relationships with bishops and abbots who could bolster his claims and stabilize fragile regions of the kingdom. In this delicate dance, Henry balanced deference with authority, piety with pragmatism, and reverence with political acumen. Despite the pressures of kingship, Henry's personality began to emerge with clarity. He was disciplined yet charismatic, demanding yet approachable, resolute yet capable of measured humility. Nobles and commoners alike sensed a rare combination of intellect and courage. In corridors of power and on training grounds alike, whispers of admiration and cautious respect began to spread. Henry's youth, once seen as a liability, increasingly became an asset, an emblem of energy, vision, and the promise of decisive leadership. By the end of his first year on the throne, Henry had begun to assert a distinct presence. England watched as a young king navigated the treacherous waters of succession, rebellion, and diplomacy. The seeds of leadership had been sown in council chambers, on the training field, and in the quiet moments of reflection atop palace battlements. Every encounter, every decision, every victory, and every misstep added to the forging of a ruler who would one day achieve what few imagined possible: the miraculous victory at Agincourt. The stage was now set. Across the English Channel, France loomed as both adversary and opportunity, its fragmented court underestimating the resolve of a young king whose name would soon echo in every hall of power, from the lowest village to the grandest palace. Henry V's journey was only beginning. The challenges ahead would test every skill, every virtue, and every ounce of courage he possessed. And it was on this foundation, tempered by youth, sharpened by experience, and guided by a vision that the legend of Henry V would be built. England had begun to settle under the steady gaze of its new king. Yet peace was a fragile illusion. The transition from prince to sovereign demanded more than ceremony. It required mastery of both sword and word, insight into politics, and the shrewd management of ambition. Henry V, though young, recognized the duality of his role. To be a king was to be a guardian of the realm, a commander of armies, a diplomat, and a judge. The crown bore not only privilege but responsibility, and each day brought its own trials. From the very first days of his reign, Henry set about consolidating his authority. Noble factions, long accustomed to the indecision of youth, now faced a monarch who measured words with precision and acted decisively. The courts of London, Westminster, and Windsor became arenas where alliances were forged and rivalries tested. Henry navigated these treacherous waters with a delicate balance of firmness and tact, offering honor where it encouraged loyalty, yet demonstrating unyielding resolve when confronted with dissent. The young king's understanding of human nature became a foundation of his leadership. He observed the posture of a lord, the hesitation in a servant's voice, the flicker of doubt in an advisor's eyes. Each detail revealed a layer of intent, ambition, or fear. In private councils, he encouraged debate, allowing his counselors to speak freely. Yet he reserved the right to decide with clarity and authority. This combination of attentiveness and decisiveness fostered respect, even among those predisposed to challenge him. Yet England's stability depended not only on internal control, but on the broader political landscape. Across the Channel, France remained a looming concern. The English claim to the French throne had long been a source of tension, and although diplomacy offered a path short of war, it demanded careful strategy. Henry was keenly aware that the perception of strength was as vital as strength itself. He dispatched emissaries, cultivated alliances, and tested the French court with letters and subtle threats, seeking to assert England's rights while avoiding premature conflict. Cinematically, one might imagine Henry seated at a polished table, candlelight dancing on the stone walls, maps spread before him. Advisors lean in, arguing over towns, taxes, and troop movements, their voices rising and falling. The young king listens intently, absorbing each argument, weighing risks and benefits, before issuing orders with measured confidence. Even the smallest gesture, a nod, a pause, a pointed question carries authority. Henry's presence commands attention, not through fear alone, but through the calculated weight of intellect, courage, and vision. Simultaneously, Henry cultivated the loyalty of his commanders and household knights. He understood that a king without the devotion of those who served him on and off the battlefield was vulnerable. In training grounds across the countryside, he drilled with soldiers, demonstrating skill with sword and lance, yet also listening to their grievances, sharing their burdens, and inspiring trust. These interactions reinforced a crucial lesson. A leader must not only direct, but embody the courage and discipline he expects of others. The domestic realm demanded attention as well. England's treasury was modest, strained by previous conflicts and ongoing needs of governance. Henry oversaw fiscal policies with precision, ensuring that nobles and merchants alike contributed to the stability of the kingdom. Taxes, trade agreements, and enforcement of royal rights became part of his daily regimen, a task as exacting as any battlefield maneuver. Here, too, diplomacy was essential. A heavy hand could breed rebellion, yet leniency could invite neglect. The young king learned quickly that governance required the same balance of resolve and prudence as war. In parallel, Henry maintained careful relationships with the church. Bishops and abbots wielded influence over both public opinion and political legitimacy, and the king understood that spiritual authority could fortify temporal power. His patronage of clerics, attendance at Mass, and observance of sacred traditions demonstrated piety, while subtly signaling control over institutions that might otherwise challenge his authority. The crown was not merely a seat of power. It was a symbol entwined with the moral and spiritual fabric of the kingdom. Henry's diplomacy extended beyond France to England's neighbors. Scotland, Ireland, and the Welsh marches required vigilance. Each region carried its own history of rebellion and unrest, and Henry's strategy was a careful mix of negotiation, military preparedness, and, when necessary, decisive intervention. His reputation for fairness and intelligence earned respect, while his decisiveness ensured that threats were contained before they could escalate. England began to see, quietly but unmistakably, a king capable of unifying a realm that had long been fractured. Cinematically, the young king could be envisioned standing on a castle wall at dusk, the wind tugging at his cloak, his gaze sweeping over the rolling hills and the distant townships. Each lighted window represents a household, each road a path of opportunity or peril. In this tableau, Henry is both observer and orchestrator, absorbing the complexities of kingship, anticipating challenges, and preparing for decisions that will ripple across history. His youth is no longer a liability. It is an asset, a vessel of energy, vision, and determination. By the end of this early phase of Henry's reign, the foundation for his future campaigns was being laid. England had begun to coalesce under his rule. Factions were held in check, and the machinery of governance operated under a new, disciplined hand. Yet the larger test awaited across the Channel. France remained both prize and adversary, its fractured court underestimating the resolve of a young king whose strategic mind and relentless will were only beginning to emerge. Henry V was no longer simply a prince or a son of kings. He was a sovereign preparing to assert his claim, marshal his forces, and confront challenges that would define his legacy. The burden of youth had been transformed into a mantle of authority. With the foundations of power secure, he could now turn his attention toward the grand stage of history, the revival of England's claim to the French throne, a path fraught with danger, diplomacy, and, ultimately, war. His hand rests lightly on a sword, symbolizing both the king's duty and his readiness. Outside, the kingdom breathes, unaware of the challenges ahead, while the young king contemplates strategy, ambition, and destiny. Every choice, every calculated risk, brings him closer to the battlefield where history will remember his courage and his genius. The English court had grown accustomed to the disciplined presence of Henry V. Yet across the Channel, the French watched with a mixture of skepticism and impatience. Charles VI, the French king, presided over a realm riddled with internal disputes, power struggles, and a fragile nobility that often acted in its own interests. While England's young king consolidated his authority at home, he turned his gaze outward, studying the French court as a strategist observes an opponent, seeking every weakness and opportunity. Henry understood the value of diplomacy. Letters were dispatched, envoys traveled on arduous roads, and messages were delivered with precision, carefully phrased to assert England's claims while avoiding unnecessary provocation. Yet, even as he extended the hand of negotiation, Henry prepared for war. This duality, negotiating with civility while readying for battle, was a hallmark of his reign. It demonstrated to both allies and adversaries that Henry's mind was not limited by emotion or impulse. It was tactical, deliberate, and unyielding. Advisors and clerks pore over documents detailing French troop movements, the strengths of fortresses, and supply routes. Henry listens attentively to each argument, weighing the merits of diplomacy against the inevitability of conflict. His decisions are decisive yet measured, each order reinforcing his vision of a campaign that will require intelligence, courage, and endurance. The young king's emissaries returned with intelligence from the French court. Their reports painted a picture of arrogance, indecision, and internal discord. French nobles underestimated Henry's youth and the growing discipline of his forces. They regarded England's claims as mere bluster, unaware that the English king had already begun to transform his army into a cohesive, battle-ready force. Every observation, every report was filed in Henry's mind, shaping strategies that combined audacity with calculated risk. Meanwhile, Henry maintained vigilance within his own kingdom, raising funds for an expedition across the Channel required delicate negotiation with nobles, merchants, and clerics. Taxes were levied with care, loans were secured, and ships prepared to transport soldiers, horses, and supplies. The logistics of war were as critical as the strategy of battle, and Henry oversaw every detail with the precision of a master planner. His attention to these seemingly mundane tasks would ensure that when the moment arrived, England's forces were not only formidable but supremely organized. Training and morale were central to Henry's preparations. Soldiers drilled in fields and castles, learning formations, practicing archery, and honing combat skills under the watchful eye of their king. Henry rode among them, demonstrating techniques, offering guidance, and sharing in the hardship of long hours and harsh conditions. His presence inspired loyalty. Soldiers saw not a distant monarch, but a leader willing to endure the same fatigue, cold, and uncertainty they faced. These small but significant acts forged cohesion, discipline, and trust qualities that would be decisive in the battles to come. Culturally and politically, Henry also sought to frame the coming conflict as a matter of honor, legitimacy, and destiny. Public proclamations emphasized England's rightful claim to the French crown, appealing to national pride, religious sanction, and the sense of historical duty. Clergy reinforced these messages, presenting the king's campaign as divinely guided, a righteous assertion of authority rather than mere conquest. The interplay between faith, politics, and military ambition became a subtle yet powerful tool, aligning hearts and minds behind the young sovereign's vision. Cinematically, one could imagine the king riding along the Thames at dawn, the mists curling around stone bridges and timbered houses, his gaze distant, focused on the imagined battlefields of northern France. Courtiers and soldiers flank him in respectful formation, yet their eyes follow his every move, inspired by the clarity of purpose in his expression. Each breath of wind carries with it the promise of future conflict, the inevitability of confrontation, and the first stirrings of the legend that will define Henry V. As the campaign in England solidified, Henry carefully considered the timing and scale of the French expedition. His mind weighed the strengths and weaknesses of the French forces, the terrain of potential battlefields, and the capabilities of his own army. Supply lines, reinforcements, and the reliability of local allies were mapped with meticulous care. Every detail, no matter how small, was integrated into a grand strategy designed to maximize England's chances of success while minimizing unnecessary risk. Henry also considered the personal dimension of leadership. Letters to trusted nobles emphasized loyalty, duty, and the promise of honor. He cultivated personal bonds with commanders who would one day fight at his side, forging relationships based on trust, mutual respect, and shared ambition. These connections were as essential to victory as tactics, for a united leadership could inspire courage and discipline among the ranks, while discord among commanders could doom even the most meticulously planned campaign. Despite the pressure, Henry remained aware of the human element in warfare. Soldiers were not merely instruments of strategy. They were men with fears, hopes, and loyalties. By understanding their needs, observing their interactions, and inspiring confidence, the king nurtured an army capable of enduring the physical and psychological strains of extended campaigns. Discipline was enforced, yet morale was cultivated, creating a force that would soon confront overwhelming odds with courage and cohesion. By the close of this preparatory phase, England was poised on the brink of history. Henry V had transformed from a young king learning the ropes of power into a sovereign ready to assert his claims across the Channel. Diplomacy had secured intelligence, alliances, and understanding. Domestic governance had stabilized the realm, and the army had been molded into a disciplined instrument of strategy and courage. Ships lie ready in the harbor, banners fluttering in the brisk wind, and men move with purpose and precision. Henry's gaze is fixed beyond the horizon, eyes reflecting both resolve and anticipation. The young king, once defined by youth and expectation, now embodies the command, vision, and courage that will carry him and England into legend. Across the Channel, France loomed as both challenge and opportunity. The Hundred Years' War had left its scars battlefields littered with memories of past campaigns, dynastic claims contested through blood and diplomacy, and kings whose authority was as fragile as their alliances. England's claim to the French crown was not a mere fantasy of ambition. It was grounded in centuries of lineage and the legal intricacies of succession, yet it had long been overshadowed by the complexity of politics and the strength of French nobles. For Henry V, understanding this tangled web was as critical as mastering the battlefield. Henry studied history with the precision of a scholar and the intuition of a commander. Chronicles of Edward III, victories, defeats, and treaties were meticulously analyzed. He traced the legacy of English claims to French territories, the shifting allegiances of dukes and counts, and the fractious nature of the French court. France was not a monolith, it was a mosaic of competing interests, proud yet divided, wealthy yet vulnerable. To a king of vision, these fractures were not obstacles but opportunities. The French court, under Charles VI, seemed oblivious to the growing threat across the Channel. Courtly indulgence, internal rivalries, and a monarch whose mental health fluctuated between lucidity and despair created gaps that a perceptive opponent could exploit. Henry's emissaries returned with accounts of haughty nobles dismissing England's potential, of advisors confident that a young king would falter. These reports were met not with arrogance but with methodical planning. Henry understood the danger of underestimating France, yet he also recognized that France's own divisions could be turned to advantage. Cinematically, one could imagine Henry in the quiet of his private chambers, a map of northern France illuminated by the pale glow of a single lantern. His fingers trace rivers, fortresses, and towns. Advisors cluster around, debating the merits of diplomacy versus force, weighing supply lines and troop movements. Henry listens with patience, occasionally interjecting with a question, a suggestion, a plan that shifts the trajectory of strategy. His youth belied a mind capable of strategic depth, a combination of intellect and instinct that would soon define his military genius. England, for its part, was not without challenges. Although Henry had consolidated power domestically, the realm had yet to fully embrace a foreign campaign. Taxation, the raising of levies, and the assembly of ships and supplies demanded careful negotiation. Nobles needed incentives, merchants required security, and clerics were courted for spiritual endorsement. Every element of domestic governance intersected with military ambition. Failure in administration could cripple even the most brilliant strategic vision. Henry approached each challenge with meticulous calculation, recognizing that logistics and morale were as decisive as sword and shield. Henry's vision extended beyond mere conquest. He saw war as a tool to solidify legitimacy, unify his kingdom, and enhance England's prestige. Victory in France would not only extend territory, but affirm the crown's honor, demonstrate the king's capacity for leadership, and inspire the loyalty of subjects who had known little stability. Cinematically, one might imagine the young king standing on a hill outside London, observing the expanse of his realm with a keen eye, imagining the fields of France, envisioning campaigns yet to unfold, and feeling the weight of destiny pressing upon his shoulders. Diplomacy was a vital prelude to conflict. Henry sought to test French intentions, sending envoys to negotiate, delay, and observe. Letters were composed with subtlety, emphasizing claims and rights while avoiding outright insult. Every word was chosen to reveal information, to gauge reaction, and to buy time for preparations. Henry understood that the perception of negotiation could influence the morale of both armies, the confidence of allies, and the loyalty of potential supporters within France itself. Yet behind the veneer of diplomacy, the machinery of war was already turning. Henry oversaw the mustering of troops, the training of archers, and the organization of cavalry units. England's forces were forged not in arrogance, but in discipline, their cohesion and readiness cultivated with relentless attention to detail. Soldiers drilled in formation, practiced longbow volleys, and learned to endure fatigue and hardship. Henry's presence in these exercises reinforced loyalty. He did not command from a distant throne, but led alongside those who would fight and die for their king. The French misjudged the English king's preparation. Their reliance on numerical superiority and noble bravado ignored the impact of strategy, discipline, and the inspired leadership of a sovereign who understood both men and terrain. Henry exploited these assumptions, planning maneuvers that emphasized mobility, coordinated attacks, and the precise timing of engagement. Each decision, each arrangement of troops, reflected a mind attuned to both the art and science of war. Religious and cultural framing also played a role in Henry's strategy. The king cultivated the support of the church, emphasizing that England's claims were righteous, sanctioned, and just. Clergy reinforced the king's message, framing the campaign as both a political necessity and a sacred duty. Morale among troops and citizens alike was bolstered by the sense that England's cause was not merely pragmatic but ordained, a struggle imbued with divine purpose. Cinematically, the preparation for conflict could be envisioned as a montage. Soldiers marching along misty rivers, blacksmiths forging weapons, ships being loaded with supplies, envoys riding through French towns under the veil of diplomacy, and Henry himself standing atop Dover's cliffs, surveying the sea that would carry him to destiny. The tension between diplomacy and war, patience and action, intelligence and courage, defined the young king's early approach to France. Henry V had studied the enemy, assessed the terrain, rallied his people, and prepared his army with an understanding that strategy, diplomacy, and morale were inseparable. Across the Channel, France remained confident, perhaps complacent, unaware that the young king's intellect, leadership, and determination were shaping a campaign that would alter the course of history. As the cinematic frame pulls back, Henry stands alone in the shadow of his castle walls, the fading light of evening casting long silhouettes across the land. In his hand rests a map, but in his eyes burns the vision of what must be achieved. The age of Henry V is dawning not merely as King of England, but as a commander, a strategist, and a figure whose name will resonate across centuries, heralding the miracle to come at Agincourt. The English court moved with purpose. Ships were readied in the harbors, armor polished to a gleaming sheen, and provisions stockpiled with meticulous care. Henry V oversaw every detail with the precision of a master planner, understanding that success in France depended not only on courage, but on organization, discipline, and foresight. Every soldier, from the seasoned knight to the fresh levies, was accounted for, their assignments precise, their orders clear. Henry's preparation extended beyond the battlefield. Envoys were dispatched to negotiate and observe, offering concessions that were carefully calculated to delay French action, gain intelligence, and project confidence. The young king understood that diplomacy was a weapon in itself, capable of shaping perceptions, sowing doubt among the French, and buying time for the assembly of his forces. France, despite its arrogance, began to notice the methodical nature of England's preparations, though few fully grasped the scale of what was being arranged. Cinematically, one can envision Henry walking along the quay at Dover, the salty wind tugging at his cloak, observing the assembly of ships and soldiers, the rhythmic clatter of hammers in the docks, the scent of pitch and tar, the shouts of sailors and soldiers all contribute to a tableau of impending action. Henry's gaze sweeps over the harbor, contemplating the crossing, the campaign, and the challenges awaiting him in Normandy. Each detail is measured, each risk weighed, each opportunity considered. The French response was both delayed and disjointed. Charles VI's court remained internally divided, and the nobles who might have mounted a coordinated defense were distracted by personal rivalries. French intelligence underestimated the efficiency and resolve of Henry's preparations, seeing the English mustering more as a symbolic threat than a true military endeavor. This underestimation would prove critical, as Henry's meticulous planning transformed the English forces into a cohesive and highly disciplined army capable of remarkable resilience. Henry's own army reflected the careful blending of experience and fresh talent. Veteran commanders, who had served in previous campaigns, provided knowledge of battlefield tactics, siegecraft, and leadership, while newly levied troops brought energy, loyalty, and the desire to prove themselves. Training regiments emphasized coordination between archers and infantry, rapid maneuvering, and discipline under stress. Henry rode among the ranks, demonstrating techniques, encouraging the men, and instilling the confidence that their king shared both their burdens and their resolve. As preparations continued, Henry also managed the complex web of logistics necessary for the campaign. Food, armor, and weaponry were transported to the coast. Ships were provisioned for weeks at sea, and cavalry units were carefully embarked alongside infantry. Supply lines were mapped and contingencies planned, reflecting a strategic mind attuned to both immediate needs and long-term objectives. In every action, Henry demonstrated an understanding that warfare was as much about preparation and coordination as it was about courage or valor. Meanwhile, the young king cultivated the moral and spiritual framework for his campaign. Clergy across England reinforced the legitimacy of Henry's claims, emphasizing divine sanction and the righteousness of the cause. Proclamations framed the expedition not as conquest, but as a fulfillment of duty, an assertion of England's rightful inheritance, and a defense of honor against perceived French arrogance. Soldiers and citizens alike absorbed this message, bolstering morale and aligning the kingdom's collective will with the king's vision. Cinematically, one could imagine the night before departure, torches flickering along Dover's walls, the rhythmic pounding of oars on the river, soldiers making final preparations, and Henry himself pacing beneath the moonlight, studying maps and contemplating the campaign. The tension is palpable, the stakes immense, yet the young king's composure inspires those around him. He is no longer merely a prince or a sovereign in title. He is a commander whose presence instills confidence, a strategist whose mind anticipates obstacles, and a leader whose vision will guide England into legend. The crossing to France was executed with precision. Ships carried men, horses, and supplies across the channel, a movement synchronized to avoid disorder and maintain readiness for immediate engagement upon landing. Henry's attention to discipline ensured that morale remained high despite the inherent risks of sea travel. Soldiers trained in formation during the voyage, while commanders prepared contingency plans for landing, skirmishes, and reconnaissance. The English forces arrived in Normandy not as an uncertain expedition, but as a cohesive army, ready to assert its objectives with clarity and determination. Upon landing, Henry demonstrated both strategic acumen and psychological insight. Small towns were approached with a combination of diplomacy and subtle intimidation, ensuring supply lines, local support, or neutrality wherever possible. Cavalry units scouted the countryside, assessing terrain, reporting on enemy movements, and securing advantageous positions. Every maneuver reflected a balance of caution and decisiveness, a careful orchestration that would allow the English to conserve strength while maximizing the impact of each engagement. The French, meanwhile, struggled to respond effectively. Confident in their numerical superiority and relying on traditional tactics, they failed to anticipate the disciplined coordination, innovative use of longbow units, and relentless resolve of Henry's army. Skirmishes revealed the efficiency of English formations, the devastating impact of massed archers, and the leadership qualities of a king who did not hesitate to inspire courage in the face of adversity. Each encounter reinforced the growing legend of Henry V as a commander capable of turning disadvantage into opportunity. The young king had transformed diplomacy, logistics, training, and morale into instruments of strategy, establishing the foundation for what would become the legendary march toward Agincourt. Soldiers march in formation, banners flutter in the wind, and ships rest in the distance, ready for the return or reinforcement. Henry's gaze is fixed on the horizon, not with fear but with anticipation, a calculated resolve to shape history. The old conflict between England and France, rooted in centuries of dynastic claims and political rivalry, had entered a new phase. Henry V, through intellect, strategy, and leadership, had positioned England to challenge French overconfidence and exploit divisions that generations of kings had merely observed. The stage was set, the players assembled, and destiny awaited on the fields where courage, strategy, and ambition would converge. The young king's journey from consolidation of power at home to the threshold of continental conquest was complete. The campaign that would lead to the miracle at Agincourt was about to begin. France, a land of grand castles, verdant valleys, and proud nobility, had long looked upon England as a distant rival. Yet Henry V, young but resolute, was about to transform that perception. His army, disciplined, motivated, and meticulously prepared, moved with purpose through Normandy, each step a calculated assertion of England's claim. The French, confident in their superiority, regarded the English presence as an inconvenience rather than a genuine threat, a miscalculation that would prove costly. From the outset, Henry combined strategy with diplomacy. Letters and envoys were dispatched to French towns and lords, offering terms that appeared conciliatory but carried the implicit weight of his military potential. The king understood the power of appearances. Negotiation, in his hands, became a weapon. Every delayed response from the French, every dismissal of his claims, reinforced the young king's perception of both arrogance and vulnerability. He noted the overconfidence of Charles VI advisors, the indecision of French generals, and the complacency that often accompanies perceived superiority. Cinematically, one can envision Henry standing in a tent illuminated by flickering torches, maps spread before him, his eyes tracing rivers, fortresses, and the roads that led to strategic towns. Couriers arrive with updates, advisors speak in urgent whispers, but Henry remains poised, his mind weaving diplomacy and military planning into a seamless strategy. He understood that winning the war would require more than force. It required manipulation, foresight, and the exploitation of every weakness in the French command. Early skirmishes revealed the discipline and skill of the English army. Small contingents encountered French forces testing the English positions. Henry, careful yet decisive, led from the front, observing formations, adjusting strategies, and inspiring troops. His leadership transformed potential panic into confidence, fatigue into resilience, and uncertainty into a sense of purpose. Soldiers saw a king who did not merely command but shared the trials of battle, understanding their fears while fostering courage. The French, meanwhile, struggled to coordinate. Nobles often acted independently, driven by personal rivalries and ambition, while communication between commanders was slow and unreliable. This disunity contrasted sharply with the English approach, where Henry's meticulous preparation and direct oversight ensured cohesion and rapid adaptability. Cinematically, the scene might depict a fog-laden French encampment, commanders debating plans in isolation, while across the valley, Henry's army moved in disciplined formation, banners waving and archers ready, a living testament to preparation and leadership. As the English army advanced, towns and villages along the way became both strategic objectives and psychological tools. Some surrendered upon seeing the discipline and organization of Henry's forces, while others resisted, offering resistance that tested English endurance, but ultimately reinforced the army's cohesion. Henry carefully balanced aggression with prudence, understanding that every engagement, every occupation, was both a tactical decision and a message to allies and enemies alike. Henry's understanding of psychology extended to the French court. He knew that their perception of English capability was as important as actual military power. Envoys returning from the French side reported debates, indecision, and frustration among the nobility. Charles VI, though a king by title, struggled with the effective command of his realm, and this weakness did not escape Henry's attention. Cinematically, one might imagine a shadowed chamber in Paris, French lords arguing over strategy, the king oscillating between clarity and confusion, while across the Channel, Henry's preparations proceeded with relentless precision. Supply lines were a constant concern. Henry ensured that provisions, weapons, and reinforcements could reach his advancing troops without delay, using rivers, roads, and towns strategically secured along the route. Cavalry scouts surveyed terrain, reported obstacles, and identified advantageous positions for future engagements. The young king's attention to logistics transformed potential vulnerability into operational strength, ensuring that his army could endure the hardships of prolonged campaigning while maintaining the initiative. At the same time, Henry cultivated loyalty and morale through personal engagement. He visited soldiers' encampments, shared in meals, and addressed concerns directly. Stories of the king's courage, fairness, and foresight circulated among the troops, fostering not only obedience but inspiration. Soldiers understood that they were part of a campaign guided by intellect as much as valor, and this belief would prove critical in the challenges that lay ahead. Henry rides among them, cloak billowing, hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his eyes scanning both the horizon and the demeanor of his men. Every detail, from armor to morale, is observed, adjusted, and perfected, reflecting the union of strategy, leadership, and foresight that defines him as a commander of exceptional skill. French scouts and spies reported these movements, often exaggerating the size or capability of Henry's forces, unintentionally aiding his psychological strategy. The young king understood the power of perception. By appearing both formidable and disciplined, England's army sowed doubt and caution among the French, forcing them into defensive postures and reactive measures. Henry's manipulation of information, coupled with his tactical readiness, created a momentum that the French found increasingly difficult to counter. Skirmishes along the route to Normandy tested the army's endurance. English archers, trained to deliver rapid and accurate volleys, harassed French detachments, while infantry units held strategic positions, repelling attempts at encirclement. Henry's presence on the field, calm and commanding, ensured that the soldiers maintained discipline under pressure. Each minor engagement, though not decisive, reinforced the army's cohesion, the king's authority, and the psychological advantage over a fragmented enemy. Henry's army had moved with purpose through Normandy. Diplomacy and deception had sown confusion in the French ranks, and the young king's leadership had transformed preparation into both strategy and morale. Cinematically, one can envision a wide shot of the English army resting on a ridge at sunset, banners fluttering against the blood-red sky, Henry standing at the forefront, contemplating the next phase of the campaign. Across the horizon, the French forces gather, unaware of the precision and discipline that will soon confront them. The tension builds. The march toward Agincourt is underway, a fusion of intellect, courage, and preparation. Every decision Henry has made, from diplomacy to logistics, from training to psychological warfare, has converged toward this moment. The battlefield approaches, and with it, the miracle that will define his reign, immortalizing Henry V as both king and legendary commander. The English army, though exhausted from weeks of marching through rain-soaked countryside and narrow roads, moved with unwavering determination. Mud clung to boots and armor, and the air carried the scent of wet earth, sweat, and the tang of iron. Every step was laborious. Yet the men knew that their king, young but resolute, marched alongside them not as a distant commander but as a leader who shared their trials. Henry's presence infused endurance with purpose. Fatigue became courage. Uncertainty transformed into resolve. Henry rides at the forefront, cloak billowing, eyes scanning the horizon. He observes every detail: the positioning of units, the spacing between columns, the state of supplies, and the morale of his men. Each adjustment is made with precision, ensuring that despite exhaustion, the army retains cohesion and readiness for the confrontation looming ahead. French scouts reported the English movements, but miscalculations abounded. The French, overconfident in numerical superiority, underestimated the discipline and resilience of Henry's army. Many believed that fatigue and attrition would cripple the English long before they could engage effectively. Others, distracted by internal rivalries, failed to coordinate a unified strategy. Cinematically, French commanders are depicted in ornate tents, maps spread across tables, debating and arguing, while clouds gather over the muddy terrain below, unaware that a disciplined army advances with quiet determination. Henry recognized both the dangers and opportunities presented by this stage of the campaign. The landscape near Agincourt, a narrow, muddy strip flanked by dense woods, was constraining. Traditional cavalry maneuvers would be limited, forcing French knights into bottlenecks where their numerical advantage could be neutralized. Henry's longbowmen, trained to deadly effect, would exploit these conditions. Every aspect of terrain, weather, and troop disposition was assessed, and every decision reflected the young king's growing mastery of strategy. As the army approached the village of Agincourt, tension among the men was palpable. Letters from the French demanded surrender, and rumors of overwhelming enemy numbers circulated. Henry moved among his troops, offering encouragement, demonstrating calm resolve, and instilling confidence. Soldiers, reassured by his leadership, began to see not merely the danger ahead, but the possibility of glory, the chance to turn a seemingly hopeless march into a historic triumph. Cinematically, the scene might depict the English troops filing through a narrow defile, the woods pressing close on either side. Rain slicks the ground, horses stumble, and foot soldiers slog through mud. Yet banners wave, armor gleams despite the weather, and the disciplined formations advance steadily. Henry rides alongside his captains, adjusting ranks, issuing orders, and observing French positions in the distance. The camera would linger on his determined expression, revealing a king who understands that leadership requires both foresight and presence. French forces began to take positions near Agincourt, confident that the exhausted English could be crushed. Knights and men-at-arms, heavily armored, filled the fields, while crossbowmen and infantry prepared for what they anticipated would be a straightforward engagement. Their overconfidence, however, blinded them to the vulnerabilities created by narrow terrain, mud, and the disciplined use of longbows. Henry, aware of these weaknesses, positioned his forces carefully, creating defensive lines capable of withstanding cavalry charges and concentrated assaults. The English archers, wielding longbows, were deployed on the flanks and in front of the main infantry line. Stakes were driven into the ground to impede mounted attacks, and troops were arranged to maximize the efficiency of both ranged and close combat units. Henry's attention to detail transformed the battlefield itself into a strategic weapon, turning disadvantageous conditions into an advantage that would soon define the course of history. Cinematically, the tension builds as soldiers prepare for nightfall. Campfires flicker, casting long shadows across the muddy field, and the rhythmic sound of rain on tents creates a backdrop of suspense. Henry inspects positions, speaks quietly with captains, and reviews strategies. The atmosphere is one of anticipation and controlled anxiety. Men know that the coming day may determine not only the campaign's success, but their survival. Henry also addressed the psychological dimension of battle. He delivered speeches to inspire courage, emphasizing honor, divine sanction, and the righteousness of the cause. Soldiers, hearing their king speak not merely as a commander but as a leader who shared their burdens, felt a renewed determination. Cinematically, one might imagine Henry riding along the lines at dawn, the fog lifting, banners still dripping with rain, voices rising in unified resolve. The young king's charisma transformed fear into courage, uncertainty into belief, and exhaustion into readiness. French commanders, still confident, failed to adjust their tactics to the conditions. Many of their knights charged into the constricted, muddy fields with heavy armor, expecting the English to crumble. Henry had anticipated this. His infantry formed defensive wedges, while archers unleashed volleys of arrows that would soon decimate the advancing French lines. The stage was set. The miracle of Agincourt would not come from chance, but from preparation, strategy, and the leadership of a king who had transformed every disadvantage into an instrument of victory. Every soldier knew his role, every unit was prepared, every decision reflected the meticulous planning of a young king who had turned diplomacy, deception, and strategy into instruments of preparation. The French, blinded by arrogance and misjudgment, stood ready to march into a trap that would forever define Henry V's legacy. The fog lifts slightly, revealing the French army massed in the distance, confident but vulnerable. A sense of foreboding hangs over the valley, a quiet before the storm, as the stage is set for one of the most legendary battles in medieval history. The morning of the 25th of October 1415 dawned gray and overcast, the sky heavy with clouds that mirrored the tension gripping the English army. Mud clung to every boot, every piece of armor, and the narrow fields of Agincourt stretched before them, bordered by dense woods that hemmed in their formations. Soldiers, long fatigued by the march from Harfleur, waited silently, aware that the day would test not only their endurance but the very limits of courage and discipline. Henry V moved among his troops, riding slowly along the ranks, observing every face, every posture, every sign of readiness. He spoke little, yet his presence alone inspired confidence. The king's cloak, damp from the morning mist, billowed behind him, and his hand rested lightly on the hilt of his sword, a symbol of both authority and shared hardship. Cinematically, one can picture his calm silhouette against the low-hanging fog, a young king poised to lead men into history. French forces, confident in their overwhelming numbers, prepared to advance. Heavy cavalry, knights in gleaming armor, and infantry filled the horizon. Their banners, bright and ornate, contrasted sharply with the more austere English standards. Yet beneath the surface of their confidence lay misjudgment. The French had underestimated the discipline, training, and cunning of Henry's army, and the terrain itself, muddy fields narrowed by hedges and woods, was working subtly in favor of the English. Henry had anticipated every challenge. Stakes had been driven into the ground to impede cavalry charges. Archers were strategically placed along the flanks, and infantry formed defensive wedges that could withstand both frontal assaults and flanking maneuvers. Every soldier knew his role. Every unit had practiced coordination. The English army was not merely prepared, it was poised to transform apparent weakness into lethal advantage. Horses strain against mud, knights shout commands, and the ground trembles under the weight of armor and hooves. The English archers, longbows at the ready, kneel in disciplined formation, fingers tracing the strings, eyes fixed on the approaching threat. Arrows, sharpened and meticulously crafted, await the signal that will soon rain death upon the enemy. Henry's command was clear and measured. He understood that courage alone would not suffice. Timing, coordination, and morale were paramount. The longbowmen, many of them seasoned veterans, understood the devastating potential of their weapons. Each arrow loosed into the advancing French ranks carried not only physical force, but the embodiment of English resolve, honed through weeks of marching, skirmishing, and relentless preparation. The opening clash was deliberate and strategic. French knights, heavily armored and confident, surged forward, expecting to break the English lines through sheer momentum. Instead, they encountered a deadly combination of stakes, mud, and precise arrow volleys. Horses stumbled, riders fell, and confusion rippled through the ranks. Cinematically, one can imagine the chaos. Men and horses entangled, the muddy ground betraying the overconfidence of the attackers, while the English held firm, disciplined, and resolute. Henry observed the unfolding battle, adjusting orders, reinforcing weak points, and ensuring that morale remained unshaken. His voice, though not loud, carried authority and reassurance. Soldiers saw their king not behind the lines but in command, understanding the ebb and flow of combat, inspiring courage, and maintaining cohesion amidst the chaos. Cinematically, his figure stands like a beacon amidst the swirling confusion of battle, a focal point for both strategy and inspiration. The French, frustrated by unexpected resistance, attempted repeated charges. each met with disciplined volleys from English longbows, further impeding their momentum. Infantry units, armed with pikes and swords, reinforced defensive positions, exploiting every advantage offered by terrain and preparation. What the French perceived as numerical superiority was neutralized by strategy, terrain, and the steadfast courage of the English soldiers. Soldiers fall, horses collapse, and confusion spreads through the ranks. The English, though weary from weeks of marching, remained composed, every movement calculated, every unit coordinated. This was not merely a battle of brute force. It was a testament to preparation, leadership, and the transformation of adversity into advantage. Henry's presence on the battlefield became a symbol of unity and resolve. He moved along the lines, observing, signaling, and reinforcing positions. His calm in the face of chaos inspired confidence, reminding soldiers that discipline, courage, and strategy would prevail over raw numbers. Cinematically, the king's gaze sweeps across the battlefield, noting every misstep, every opportunity, every chance to turn the tide further in favor of the English. By the end of the morning, it became increasingly evident that the French had underestimated both the English army and their young king. Momentum, often the key to victory in medieval warfare, remained elusive for the attackers. The English, though outnumbered, utilized discipline, strategy, and terrain to devastating effect. The first stage of the Battle of Agincourt had been set a dramatic tableau of determination, preparation, and the emergence of a leader whose courage would inspire generations. As the sun broke through the morning clouds, casting light upon the muddy fields, Henry prepared for the next phase of the engagement. The English were positioned not merely to defend, but to capitalize on the overconfidence and errors of the French. Every archer, every infantryman, every knight knew that their survival and the glory of England rested upon discipline, timing, and the leadership of a king who had transformed uncertainty into opportunity. Across the field, the French masses hesitate, their confidence shaken by the unfolding disaster. The stage was set for the historic moment that would forever define the young king's legacy, a miracle in the mud, a testament to strategy, courage, and leadership. The muddy fields of Agincourt became a crucible of courage, strategy, and sheer human endurance. By midday, the French forces, confident in their overwhelming numbers, had advanced into the constricted English positions. Horses stumbled in the mud, armored knights collided, and the noise of clashing metal reverberated across the narrow valley. Yet the English lines, disciplined and coordinated, stood unbroken, a testament to preparation, foresight, and leadership. Cinematically, the scene unfolds with vivid contrasts. The chaos of the French cavalry and men-at-arms struggling to advance through the mud against the composed, calculated formations of the English soldiers. Arrows rained from longbows, striking both men and horses, while infantry braced and pivoted to hold the line. Every movement, every command, every defensive tactic reflected Henry's meticulous planning and understanding of both terrain and enemy psychology. Henry V, mounted and observant, rode along the lines. His eyes scanned the battlefield, reading the ebb and flow of combat as if the muddy chaos were a living map. He adjusted positions, reinforced weak points, and sent signals that were carried swiftly by captains to ensure coordination. His presence was not merely symbolic, it was functional, practical, and crucial. Soldiers fought with renewed vigor, inspired by the knowledge that their king shared both risk and strategy. The English longbowmen unleashed volleys with relentless precision. Thousands of arrows arced through the gray sky, darkening the field and striking French knights and infantry alike. Horses, unable to gain traction in the mud, fell under the combined weight of armor and arrow, creating bottlenecks that compounded the chaos. Cinematically, one can imagine arrows slicing through the air, banners toppled, and the French lines disrupted, unable to maneuver in the constricted terrain. Despite their numbers, the French struggled to organize coordinated assaults. Rivalries among nobles and miscommunication between commanders amplified disorder. Individual knights attempted heroics, charging through mud and enemy fire, but each advance was met with calculated resistance. The English used stakes and terrain to funnel French attacks into deadly kill zones, turning overconfidence into catastrophic vulnerability. Henry's leadership became increasingly visible. At one point, he personally led a small contingent to reinforce a threatened flank, demonstrating both bravery and tactical acumen. Soldiers witnessed their king move with calm determination amidst chaos, issuing orders and inspiring courage. The tide of battle shifted as the French forces, bogged down and demoralized, began to falter. Archers exploited every opening, targeting commanders and breaking formations. English infantry, disciplined and coordinated, pushed forward, using short swords and pikes to neutralize the armored French knights who had become ensnared in mud and confusion. What appeared impossible, the triumph of a smaller, exhausted army over a larger force, unfolded as a controlled, almost miraculous execution of strategy and courage. As the French retreated in disorder, Henry continued to inspire and direct his troops. Captured prisoners were secured, wounded soldiers tended, and archers repositioned to maintain pressure. The king understood that victory was not merely about survival or glory, it was about seizing the initiative, consolidating advantage, and ensuring that morale and discipline were maintained until the last threat had been neutralized. The English victory at Agincourt was decisive. Despite being heavily outnumbered, estimates suggest the French had at least 4 times as many men. The combination of terrain, strategy, discipline, and leadership turned potential disaster into triumph. Casualties were catastrophic for the French, while English losses, though significant, were comparatively minimal. The miracle was not mere luck. It was the culmination of careful planning, unyielding morale, and Henry's inspirational command. The fog lifts slightly, revealing the full extent of the French disarray, toppled banners, and abandoned armor. Henry rides through the remnants, acknowledging the bravery of his men, maintaining discipline, and preparing to consolidate the victory. The young king's reputation, already formidable, begins to transform into legend. The psychological impact on both armies was profound. The French, humiliated and decimated, retreated in confusion, their confidence shattered. England, though weary and battered, celebrated a triumph that would echo for generations. News of the miraculous victory spread swiftly, fueling the myth of Henry V, a king whose youth did not hinder command, whose courage inspired men, and whose strategic genius turned adversity into legendary success. Beyond immediate military success, the battle cemented Henry's leadership and legitimacy. Nobles who doubted the young king were silenced by his performance. Allies gained confidence, and opponents recognized that England's resolve was embodied in a monarch willing to lead personally into peril. Cinematically, the scene could linger on Henry observing the horizon, contemplating both the cost of victory and the weight of his growing responsibility as a king and military strategist. As the day drew to a close, Henry ensured that discipline and order were maintained. Victory, he understood, was fragile if mismanaged in the aftermath of chaos. Soldiers rested but remained vigilant. Archers maintained positions to deter any counterattack, and wounded were attended to with urgency. The young king's foresight extended beyond the battlefield, encompassing the critical task of consolidating both victory and morale. Henry V, mounted and resolute, surveys the field with a mixture of relief, pride, and contemplation. The miracle of Agincourt was complete, but the lessons of leadership, courage, and strategy would echo long after the banners had been folded and the mud washed away. The battle was over, yet Henry's legend had only begun. The miracle at Agincourt would not be remembered merely for its tactical brilliance, but as a testament to the vision, courage, and unwavering leadership of a young king who transformed a desperate situation into an immortal victory. The fields of Agincourt, once a scene of chaos and mud, had been transformed by the extraordinary courage and discipline of Henry V and his army. Dawn after the battle revealed the full extent of the English triumph. Mud-slick soldiers walked among the remnants of French banners, fallen armor, and the bodies of men who had overestimated their own power. The victory was absolute, yet the cost was etched in every weary expression, in every aching limb, and in the somber duty of tending to the wounded. Cinematically, the scene unfolds as a panorama. English troops standing in tight formation amid the devastation, the fog lifting to reveal the depth of the French disaster. Arrows still protrude from shields, and mud-streaked banners flutter weakly in the morning breeze. Henry, mounted atop a horse, surveys the field with a calm, measured gaze. The young king is both a participant and a strategist, a leader fully aware that the victory was hard-won, but that its consequences would shape the destiny of nations. Henry's first concern was order. Discipline, which had been crucial during the battle, remained essential in its aftermath. Captured French nobles were secured, the wounded attended, and soldiers given time to rest, but kept ready to respond to any unforeseen threat. Henry understood that victory, if mishandled, could quickly turn into chaos or be undermined by political complications. His attention to detail ensured that the army remained cohesive, morale intact, and the spoils of triumph organized efficiently. The psychological impact of Agincourt on both armies was profound. For the English, the battle reinforced national pride, confidence in leadership, and the effectiveness of strategy and preparation. Soldiers who had faced overwhelming odds now bore the pride of having achieved the improbable. The scene captures men exchanging glances of quiet relief, tears of exhaustion mingling with smiles of accomplishment, while officers move among them, checking positions, supplies, and the welfare of their men. For the French, the defeat was a crushing blow, exposing internal divisions, strategic errors, and the consequences of overconfidence. Nobles who had anticipated easy victory now faced humiliation, shattered prestige, and political ramifications that would reverberate throughout the French court. The battlefield, a muddy tableau of destruction and disarray, became a symbol of the dangers of arrogance and the costs of underestimating a determined and disciplined foe. Henry's triumph extended beyond mere battlefield success. The victory at Agincourt strengthened his legitimacy as king, silencing doubters and consolidating loyalty among the English nobility. Cinematically, one can imagine courtiers, upon receiving news of the outcome, reacting with awe and newfound respect. Letters would be written, chroniclers would record the day in glowing terms, and Henry's reputation began to transcend the immediate military victory, moving toward the realm of legend. Diplomatically, the battle shifted the balance of power. Henry's claim to the French crown, though still contested, gained renewed vigor. Alliances and negotiations would now unfold under the shadow of his military prowess. The French court, once confident, had to reconsider its approach, acknowledging the strategic brilliance and bold leadership of the young English king. Cinematically, one could visualize the French court in disarray. Nobles in heated debate, envoys dispatched to assess the implications, and a nation forced to confront the unexpected consequences of underestimating their enemy. Henry, acutely aware of the fragile nature of political capital, moved quickly to consolidate gains. He sent dispatches to England, reassuring the realm of both his safety and the army's success, while simultaneously preparing for the next phase of diplomacy and conquest. His letters emphasize not only victory but also the king's commitment to justice, honor, and the protection of English interests abroad. The scene captures Henry riding in a tent illuminated by candlelight, maps spread before him, emissaries waiting, his face reflecting a mixture of fatigue and determination. The young king also understood the importance of narrative. Chroniclers and messengers were instructed to convey not only the facts of the battle, but the heroism, discipline, and moral righteousness of the English cause. Agincourt became more than a military victory. It was a story, a symbol of national unity, and the embodiment of effective leadership. Cinematically, one might imagine scribes and heralds recording accounts, their quills moving quickly across parchment as news spreads to towns and villages across England, inspiring awe and admiration. Henry's attention to both military and political details exemplified his evolving statesmanship. He knew that Agincourt was not the end of conflict, but a turning point, a chance to cement English influence and assert his claims with both force and diplomacy. Cinematically, one sees the king moving from battlefield to command tent to strategic council, balancing the immediate needs of soldiers with long-term objectives of governance and negotiation. The aftermath also revealed Henry's understanding of morale and leadership. Soldiers, aware that their king shared in their hardships and celebrated their courage, were loyal not only to their country but to the man who led them. Moments of quiet heroism emerge, Henry speaking directly to a wounded archer, sharing a word of encouragement, knights helping comrades navigate the mud, officers coordinating the care of prisoners. These human moments contrasted with the vast scale of military operations, highlighting the king's dual role as strategist and empathetic leader. As the day progressed, Henry began to plan his next steps. Although Agincourt was decisive, the war was far from over. France remained a formidable adversary, and consolidating political and military gains required careful diplomacy, strategic foresight, and continued leadership. One imagines Henry surveying the horizon from a hilltop, the sun breaking through clouds, the battlefield below still scarred but under control. He envisions campaigns, alliances, and negotiations that would extend the consequences of Agincourt far beyond the muddy valley where victory was won. The legacy of this moment, Henry understood, would be twofold. Militarily, it demonstrated the power of discipline, preparation, and leadership against overwhelming odds. Politically, it strengthened his claim, enhanced his prestige, and established him as a king capable of commanding respect from both allies and enemies. The visual of Henry standing among the exhausted but victorious English army captures the convergence of leadership, courage, and historical consequence, a young monarch whose vision and resolve transformed a desperate march into immortal glory. By the close of the day, word of the English victory had begun to reach neighboring towns and the English court. Celebrations, tempered by the somber realities of war, began to unfold. Soldiers received commendations, chroniclers prepared dispatches, and Henry himself began to be seen not merely as a capable ruler but as a national hero whose legend would endure. The miracle of Agincourt, while achieved through strategy and discipline, also became a symbol of courage, unity, and the enduring power of effective leadership. The young king's journey from the burdened heir to the victorious monarch had reached a defining moment, the consequences of which would shape both England and France for years to come. With the battlefield of Agincourt behind him, Henry V understood that victory alone was insufficient. True power required consolidation, diplomacy, and the careful cultivation of influence. The young king, though only in his mid-20s, had demonstrated tactical brilliance and personal courage. Now, he needed to transform that battlefield success into enduring political advantage. Henry's first priority was stability within his own ranks. Commanders were praised and rewarded, soldiers tended and encouraged, and discipline maintained. The English army, though victorious, was weary from fatigue, disease, and the rigors of campaign. Henry's leadership shone in these moments. He moved among men, acknowledging heroism, addressing concerns, and ensuring loyalty remained unwavering. His presence was both symbolic and practical, reinforcing the trust between ruler and army, a bond forged in the crucible of battle. Diplomatically, Henry leveraged his triumph to strengthen England's position in France. Letters were dispatched to allies and neutral states, emphasizing the legitimacy of English claims while offering negotiation where advantageous. Henry understood that military victory alone could not secure lasting authority. Political recognition and alliances were essential. The French court, humiliated and disoriented, became a theater of intrigue. Nobles debated strategy and blame, their morale shattered by the defeat. King Charles VI's advisors, once confident of easy victory, now questioned their assumptions and feared English persistence. Henry's careful calculations meant that France, while still powerful, was forced to reconsider its approach. Now wary of both the tactical skill and the psychological impact of a king who led from the front. Cinematically, shadowed halls of French castles echo with whispers of dissent, plotting, and urgent councils convened in response to news from Agincourt. Henry also recognized the power of narrative in shaping perception. Chronicles were commissioned, highlighting his heroism, the courage of his troops, and the moral righteousness of the English cause. Through these narratives, Agincourt became more than a military victory. It became a legend. Across England, towns and villages celebrated the king's triumph, while foreign courts took note of a monarch who combined strategy, valor, and political acumen in a way rarely seen in Europe. Cinematically, scribes worked late into the night, quills scratching tales of valor, while messengers set out along dirt roads to deliver news of England's miraculous victory. One of Henry's most significant political moves was addressing the French nobility. By capturing high-ranking nobles and securing advantageous hostages, he gained leverage that would be instrumental in negotiations. His actions were precise, measured, and calculated to avoid alienating potential allies while exploiting weakness among enemies. The king inspects prisoners, negotiating terms through trusted lieutenants, balancing firmness with the strategic necessity of mercy, aware that perception and honor were as crucial as military might. The morale and reputation of the English army rose dramatically. Soldiers who had endured hunger, fatigue, and relentless opposition now felt invincible under Henry's leadership. The king's personal bravery riding among men, issuing orders in the midst of battle, and inspiring courage cemented loyalty and created a bond that would endure throughout campaigns. Scenes depict soldiers singing, tending to the wounded, and preparing fortifications, all under the watchful eye of a king whose presence reassured them that triumph was both achievable and sustainable. Henry's rising reputation spread far beyond England and France. European monarchs, ambassadors, and chroniclers took note of a young king who achieved what many deemed impossible. The miracle at Agincourt became shorthand for exceptional leadership and divine favor, elevating Henry from national hero to a figure of continental significance. One could visualize envoys arriving in England, bearing messages of congratulations or concern, emphasizing the far-reaching political and symbolic implications of the English victory. In France, the consequences were profound. Nobles who had previously dominated political discourse were weakened or captured. Rivalries intensified as blame was assigned for the defeat. King Charles VI faced both internal dissent and the challenge of negotiating with an adversary who had demonstrated unmatched skill and resolve. Henry's advantage extended beyond the battlefield into the very fabric of French politics, giving him leverage for future campaigns and potential treaties. Dimly lit council chambers echo with heated debate, courtiers pacing, and advisors whispering about how to contain the unstoppable force of a young English king. Henry also cultivated his image as a chivalric ruler. By maintaining order among his own forces, respecting the code of conduct toward prisoners, and projecting both strength and mercy, he reinforced the perception of moral authority. This cultivated image strengthened his political position, both domestically and internationally. Moments of quiet reflection show Henry observing the battlefield, contemplating the balance of power, justice, and the responsibilities of kingship, capturing the complex interplay between war, morality, and leadership. At home, the news of Agincourt bolstered the legitimacy of Henry's reign. England, weary from previous instability, found renewed pride and confidence in a monarch who had proven himself on the world stage. The king's careful management of news, narrative, and political consequence ensured that the triumph became both a source of national unity and a foundation for enduring influence. Townspeople celebrate in muted reverence, chroniclers record heroic tales, and young men dream of service under a king who exemplified courage, strategy, and honor. Henry's consolidation of power extended into France through controlled advances, strategic marriages, and continued negotiations. He leveraged the victory not merely for short-term advantage but to secure lasting influence, demonstrating that leadership required foresight, adaptability, and the skillful blending of diplomacy and force. The scene portrays emissaries traveling through French towns, negotiating alliances and arranging terms, while Henry plans further campaigns with his trusted advisors, ever vigilant and ever calculating. The miracle of Agincourt had shifted perceptions, reshaped alliances, and cemented his reputation as a military genius and political strategist. Yet he remained mindful of the challenges ahead. Victory had been achieved, but the art of leadership demanded that triumph be maintained, that political and military momentum continue, and that the legacy of a young king be transformed into enduring influence. The final shots show Henry atop a hill, surveying both his weary army and the horizon of future campaigns, the sun setting behind him, a young monarch whose vision and courage had already begun to echo across the continent. After the triumph at Agincourt, England felt the surge of national pride. Yet Henry V knew that a single victory did not secure a kingdom, nor guarantee the fulfillment of his broader ambitions. The young king understood that his next move would define the trajectory of his reign, both militarily and politically. Agincourt was a miracle not only of strategy but of timing, terrain, and sheer will, but history waits for no one. To cement his legacy, Henry needed to consolidate victories, prepare for renewed campaigns, and navigate the treacherous currents of European politics. Advisors and commanders hover nearby, whispering about supply lines, fortifications, and potential alliances. The air is thick with anticipation, the sense of a nation poised on the edge of further triumph or catastrophic miscalculation. Every decision is laden with consequence. Every plan carries the weight of lives and the future of the crown. Henry's first task was to stabilize the territories already under his control. England's presence in northern France was fragile, and maintaining supply lines was critical. Diplomatic envoys were dispatched to neighboring towns and principalities, negotiating safe passage, provisioning, and the loyalty of local lords. Cinematically, the viewer sees Henry inspecting convoys of wagons laden with food, arms, and horses, while soldiers drill in muddy encampments to maintain readiness and morale. The king's attention to detail is meticulous, reflecting the duality of his role as warrior and ruler. The young king also understood the importance of political theater. England's victory at Agincourt had elevated him in the eyes of his people and across Europe, but perception alone could not secure enduring alliances or guarantee compliance. Henry employed emissaries to deliver messages framed with a careful blend of diplomacy and assertiveness. Letters to allies emphasized honor and mutual interest, while those to rivals subtly reminded them of the English king's strategic prowess. Henry's council included seasoned commanders and trusted advisors, each contributing to a broader vision of sustained dominance. Military strategy now extended beyond battlefield tactics to encompass logistics, fortifications, and the integration of new troops. The king walks among generals in the training grounds, demonstrating techniques, observing drills, and listening to counsel with a discerning eye. Every detail is considered, from archery range placement to the reinforcement of key fortresses along contested borders. The French, humbled by Agincourt, yet still a formidable adversary, were not idle. King Charles VI's court reeled from the shock of defeat, yet internal factions jockeyed for influence, seeking to exploit perceived weaknesses in the English command. Henry was acutely aware of the need to anticipate not only military opposition, but political manipulation. Shadowed council chambers in French castles are depicted, nobles whispering in corners, advisors weighing strategies, and the crown attempting to reconcile pride with pragmatism. Henry also devoted attention to his own court. England had been divided by factional disputes before his reign, and maintaining unity among nobles, advisors, and soldiers was essential. His charisma, intellect, and courage had earned respect, but he reinforced authority through careful appointments, rewards, and the cultivation of loyalty. Cinematically, Henry presides over court gatherings, listening intently, directing decisions, and subtly asserting his presence as both sovereign and strategist. Training and morale remained central to Henry's preparation. Soldiers who had endured Agincourt were seasoned, yet fatigue and the specter of disease remained threats. The king implemented rigorous drills, reinforced supply chains, and ensured that his army was both disciplined and motivated. Cinematically, viewers witness archers practicing volleys with precision, infantry marching in formation through misty dawns, and cavalrymen coordinating maneuvers under Henry's watchful eye. Every action underscores the king's understanding that preparation is as crucial as courage. Strategic alliances became the next focus. Henry pursued negotiations with sympathetic French lords and neighboring principalities, seeking to secure flanks and gather intelligence. Through subtle diplomacy, he aimed to weaken opposition before further engagements. Emissaries moved through French towns, often under the cover of night, negotiating allegiances, exchanging coded messages, and reporting back to Henry, who interprets every detail with a strategist's mind. The king's personal leadership was instrumental in maintaining morale and unity. He frequently addressed his troops, reminding them of past victories while framing future campaigns as both duty and opportunity. The scene depicts Henry atop a slight rise, speaking to his soldiers as mist curls around their armor, the sense of anticipation palpable. The bond between king and army is evident. Men fight not only for their nation, but for a leader who has shared their risks and inspired their courage. Henry also anticipated the psychological component of warfare. Maintaining the mythos of invincibility without arrogance was vital. News of Agincourt had spread, and Henry leveraged it to project strength both within England and abroad. The young king carefully balanced confidence with caution, ensuring that while enemies respected his capability, they did not anticipate recklessness. Cinematically, Henry is depicted reviewing intelligence reports, considering rumors and morale, adjusting plans with a steady hand that conveys both wisdom and restraint beyond his years. At the heart of preparation was the realization that war was a continuum, not a single event. Every village secured, every fort reinforced, and every alliance cultivated was a step toward larger objectives: reclaiming contested lands, asserting English dominance, and ultimately positioning the crown to negotiate from strength. Cinematically, the viewer sees Henry inspecting maps, sending orders, and riding through fortified towns, a young king transforming victories into sustainable strategy. The next campaign would test not only his tactical skill but his ability to wield power with foresight and resolve. The scene fades on Henry overlooking a French valley from his vantage point, the mist rising from forests and rivers, symbolic of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead, a young king poised at the cusp of shaping history once again. With careful plans in place and alliances secured, Henry V began the next stage of his campaign, advancing into French territory with precision, determination, and the weight of expectation pressing upon him. The English army, still bolstered by the morale and cohesion forged at Agincourt, now faced the grueling demands of sustained movement through contested lands. Every mile marched brought physical challenges, political calculations, and the ever-present threat of enemy action. Henry's logistical acumen became immediately apparent. Roads were repaired, supply lines reinforced, and garrisons established at strategic intervals to maintain communication and security. One can picture wagons laden with grain, flour, and weaponry, winding along narrow paths, engineers constructing temporary bridges over swollen rivers, and watchmen posted to guard against ambushes. The march was as much a test of organization as of endurance. demanding that soldiers and commanders maintain discipline under the strain of weather, terrain, and fatigue. Every town and village encountered along the route presented both opportunity and risk. Some communities welcomed the English with cautious cooperation, providing supplies and shelter in exchange for protection or negotiated terms. Others resisted, loyal to the French crown or fearful of retribution. Henry approached each situation with measured pragmatism, balancing firmness with diplomacy. One can envision tense negotiations in town squares, emissaries speaking with local leaders, and soldiers maintaining order while awaiting instructions. The psychological demands of the campaign were equally formidable. The army's success depended not only on physical endurance, but on the confidence of the men and the belief in their leader. Henry addressed this by exemplifying resilience and calm authority. He rode among the troops, sharing in their hardships, acknowledging their sacrifices, and reminding them of their past triumphs. The scene shows mist curling around soldiers' boots, firelight reflecting on armor, and the king pausing to speak quietly with weary men, reinforcing loyalty and resolve. Supply challenges were a constant concern. The English army relied on a combination of prearranged provisions, local requisition, and foraging. Yet the unpredictable nature of war in enemy territory meant shortages were inevitable. Henry's meticulous planning ensured redundancy. Convoys were staggered, reserves maintained, and messengers constantly relayed information about available resources. One can picture wagons delayed by rain-swollen rivers, scouts riding ahead to assess foraging grounds, and commanders recalibrating daily schedules to keep the army fed, armed, and rested. Throughout the march, Henry's strategic vision remained focused on positioning for the next decisive engagement. He studied terrain, river crossings, and choke points, anticipating both French movements and potential hazards. His decisions reflected an acute awareness of how geography could amplify strength or expose vulnerability. The king is depicted on a rise overlooking a river valley, the morning mist drifting past, maps spread across a horse's saddle, advisors leaning in as they debate the optimal path forward. Every choice was scrutinized, for a misstep could compromise months of planning and the hard-won reputation established at Agincourt. Town sieges and minor engagements punctuated the march. While Henry preferred negotiation and swift occupation where possible, resistance occasionally erupted, demanding tactical precision and judicious use of force. These encounters, though smaller than Agincourt, reinforced the army's discipline and Henry's command authority. Cinematically, one can see the disciplined coordination of archers, infantry, and cavalry against barricades, with Henry observing from a vantage point, issuing orders calmly amid the chaos. Each success bolstered confidence and demonstrated that the king's genius extended beyond a single battle. The human dimension of leadership was never lost on Henry. Disease, exhaustion, and the emotional toll of war weighed heavily on both soldiers and commanders. Henry ensured that the army's well-being was addressed. Healers attended the sick, rotations allowed rest, and attention was paid to morale. Cinematically, the viewer witnesses Henry visiting infirmaries, speaking with medics, and offering words of encouragement to the suffering, emphasizing that leadership extended beyond strategy to the care of those entrusted to his command. French intelligence, though demoralized by prior defeats, was active. Spies, scouts, and messengers moved to report English movements. Attempting to predict Henry's next maneuver, the king's response was meticulous. Counterintelligence, feints, and controlled misinformation ensured that the French were consistently second-guessing, often misjudging the pace and direction of the English advance. As the English army approached strategic towns and fortresses, Henry's focus shifted to positioning for the next major confrontation. The French, emboldened by numbers but wary of past losses, began concentrating their forces, unaware that the young English king had already anticipated their movements. Scouts report from hilltops, the French banners seen in the distance, and Henry convenes his commanders. Maps spread across a table illuminated by candlelight. As plans are finalized with precision and clarity, The march itself became a test of endurance, cohesion, and the application of lessons learned from Agincourt. Soldiers were pushed to their limits, yet each challenge was met with organization, discipline, and inspiration. Henry's personal presence, leading from the front, sharing hardships, and visibly demonstrating commitment, reinforced unity and trust. Cinematically, scenes depict the army navigating treacherous terrain, crossing rivers, repairing bridges, and encamping beneath storm clouds, all under the watchful eye of a determined and capable monarch. By the time the English approached the locations chosen for the next campaign, Henry's position was one of strength, both tactical and moral. His forces were cohesive, supply lines maintained, and the morale of men inspired by a leader who had proven both courageous and wise. Yet the looming confrontation reminded all that history favors neither youth nor past victories alone. The final shots depict Henry standing on a hill at dawn, the horizon dotted with enemy fortifications and banners, the morning light glinting on armor and weapons, a young king ready to once again define destiny with courage, intellect, and unyielding determination. England's campaign into France is no longer merely a test of arms. It is a drama of strategy, psychology, logistics, and leadership. The road to the next major engagement, fraught with danger and opportunity, lies ahead, and Henry V's ability to inspire, calculate, and command will once again determine the fate of nations. The air was thick with anticipation, the murmur of thousands of soldiers blending with the creaking of wagons and the distant toll of church bells from nearby villages. Henry V, standing atop a slight rise overlooking the terrain ahead, surveyed the open fields and narrow forested paths that would become the stage for the next great confrontation. The young king understood the gravity of what lay before him. This was more than a military engagement. It was a test of leadership, strategy, and the indomitable spirit of a nation poised on the edge of destiny. Soldiers adjust armor, check weapons, and whisper prayers, while the officers confer in hushed tones. Henry's calm presence belies the tension, his mind calculating every variable, anticipating the enemy's moves, and preparing to turn advantage into victory. The English army, though battle-hardened from previous campaigns, faced the daunting reality of fatigue, attrition, and the ever-present uncertainty of combat. Disease, exhaustion, and the psychological weight of prior engagements could not be ignored. Henry, aware that a leader's resolve inspires more than words alone, rode among his troops, sharing in their burdens, offering encouragement, and demonstrating the same courage he expected of them. Cinematically, the young king is depicted dismounting, speaking quietly with weary archers and infantrymen, inspecting the readiness of horses and weapons, and ensuring that every unit understood its role in the battle that awaited. Intelligence reports indicated the enemy's movements and potential formations. The French, confident in superior numbers, had begun to concentrate their forces, preparing for a clash that they believed would overwhelm the English. Yet Henry's careful reconnaissance, combined with an understanding of terrain, allowed him to anticipate and exploit weaknesses. Scouts return with information, sketches of troop placements in hand, and Henry studies the terrain with meticulous attention, noting choke points, river crossings, and the strategic value of woods and open fields. Henry's command style emphasized both discipline and initiative. Officers were empowered to act decisively within the framework of his strategy, while soldiers were drilled to respond predictably to signals, formations, and commands. The audience sees units aligning with precision, archers positioning for optimal range, infantry forming defensive lines, and cavalry ready to exploit breakthroughs. Every movement is choreographed with foresight, yet retains the fluidity required to adapt to the chaos of battle. The psychological atmosphere was critical. The English soldiers, though smaller in number, carried the memory of Agincourt, a proof of their capacity to triumph against overwhelming odds. Henry leveraged this collective memory, framing the coming fight as not only necessary but honorable. He addresses his men, voice calm yet commanding, reminding them that courage, unity, and faith in strategy can turn adversity into triumph. Soldiers respond with renewed determination, gripping weapons and raising shields, their faces a mixture of fear, resolve, and anticipation. Supply and logistical considerations, often overlooked in cinematic portrayals, played a decisive role. Henry ensured that ammunition, food, and medical resources were adequately positioned for both sustained defense and aggressive maneuvers. Wagons are arranged strategically, lines of supply extending toward the rear, with guards ensuring security against surprise raids or sabotage. Every precaution underscores the king's understanding that the preparation of men is inseparable from the preparation of material. The landscape itself became a silent ally. Henry chose the battlefield with care. Narrow approaches limited the advantage of superior enemy numbers. Muddy fields and wooded areas could disrupt cavalry charges, and river crossings could serve as both obstacles and opportunities. The scene captures the interplay of nature and strategy. The morning mist drifting across uneven terrain, trees casting long shadows, and streams reflecting light that could guide or betray movement. Every natural feature is both hazard and weapon in Henry's calculations. As the French vanguard approached, the tension mounted. Scouts reported banners appearing on the horizon, the glint of armor, and the faint rumble of advancing infantry. Henry's soldiers held formation, archers adjusting their stakes in the ground, infantry gripping spears and shields, cavalry readying mounts for rapid deployment. Cinematically, viewers witnessed the slow, deliberate unfolding of the enemy's approach. Flags waving, dust rising from trodden fields, and the measured heartbeat of preparation before the chaos of combat erupts. Communication and coordination were paramount. Henry had developed a system of signals and messengers to relay commands across the field. Runners dash between units, flags are raised to indicate shifts in formation, and officers relay orders with precision. Each component moves as part of a larger mechanism, designed to transform the collective discipline of English troops into a force capable of defeating a numerically superior opponent. Henry's personal bravery was more than symbolic. Positioned where he could observe and influence the flow of battle, he remained visible to his men, a living embodiment of courage and composure. He is depicted on horseback, helmet polished, cloak catching the morning breeze, surveying both the enemy and his army with a calm intensity. Soldiers, emboldened by his presence, prepare to act not only out of duty but out of inspiration. The army, meticulously prepared, stands ready. The enemy, confident yet unaware of the subtle traps awaiting, advances. And Henry V, a young king forged by previous victories, surveys the field with the steady gaze of one who knows that destiny is crafted as much by planning and foresight as by courage and valor. The scene fades on Henry, silhouetted against the dawn, banners fluttering, armor gleaming, the quiet tension before the storm, signaling that history is about to witness the remarkable heroism of a young monarch and his men. The morning sun barely broke through a low-hanging mist as Henry V gave the final instructions to his men. The English army, though outnumbered, stood resolute. The mud-soaked fields of Agincourt stretched before them, narrow enough to neutralize the numerical advantage of the French forces. Cinematically, the scene captures the grim determination etched into the soldiers' faces, the glint of steel in armor, and the steady hands gripping longbows and spears, all waiting for the clash that would define legend. Henry's tactical genius came to the forefront. The positioning of his forces, honed by careful reconnaissance and experience, created a natural funnel, forcing the French to attack along constrained lanes where their knights and cavalry could not maneuver freely. Stakes were planted to protect archers, who formed deadly hedgerows of defense. Cinematically, viewers see rows of wooden stakes jutting from the ground. Archers crouched behind them, eyes scanning the advancing enemy, ready to unleash a hail of arrows that would darken the sky. The French, confident in their superiority, advanced with banners flying, trumpets blaring, and a rhythm meant to intimidate. Cinematically, The dust rises in clouds beneath the massed infantry and mounted knights, armor clinking and swords glinting in the dim morning light. Yet every step into the narrow, muddy corridor played into Henry's design. Horses struggled, armored knights sank into the mud, and the momentum of numbers became a liability rather than an advantage. Henry moved among his troops with deliberate visibility. His presence inspired courage, the sight of a young king unwavering in the face of overwhelming odds reinforcing the soldiers' morale. Cinematically, he rides along the ranks, helmet catching the light, cloak flowing, giving silent signals to captains, offering reassurance to the weary, and readying the archers to release the first deadly volley. Every motion, every glance was a masterclass in leadership under pressure. The first arrows rained down, a blackened storm against the French vanguard. The English longbow, a weapon of precision and power, tore through the confidence of the French, each volley a reminder that strategy and discipline could triumph over sheer numbers. Screams, the clash of steel, and the thud of arrows punctuated the air. Yet the English lines held firm, steady, under the command of Henry. French knights attempted to regroup, pushing forward with heavy cavalry, but the mud and narrow lanes frustrated their charges. Cinematically, armored men struggled to maintain formation, horses faltering in the sticky fields, the momentum of attack blunted by terrain and foresight. English archers release volley after volley, while infantrymen brace behind stakes, ready to strike at anyone breaking the line. The battlefield becomes a theater of contrasts. Chaos for the overconfident French, controlled precision for the disciplined English. Henry's leadership was evident not only in strategy but in timing. He held reserves, deploying them where the French faltered, reinforcing weak points, and pressing advantages with cold calculation. Every decision was a calculated stroke in a larger masterpiece of battlefield management. Amid the chaos, individual acts of heroism stood out. Soldiers who had endured fatigue and hunger fought with extraordinary courage. Cinematically, close-ups capture archers steadying their bows under fire, infantrymen holding ground against overwhelming odds, and officers rallying men with clenched fists and determined shouts. Yet it was Henry's presence that turned individual courage into collective triumph. When the young king rode into the fray, sword raised, he became the focal point of resolve, a living symbol of unity and determination. As the battle wore on, the French formations began to crumble. Confusion spread, orders lost in the tumult, and the narrow approach compounded their difficulty. The combination of terrain, archery, and disciplined infantry converted a numerical disadvantage into a tactical advantage that would become the hallmark of Agincourt. Henry's understanding of morale proved decisive. He encouraged captured soldiers to surrender, kept wounded men cared for, and maintained the cohesion of his army even in the heat of combat. Cinematically, scenes show Henry observing the battlefield with unflinching focus, signaling reinforcements, and ensuring that discipline remained intact despite the chaos around him. The English soldiers, inspired by the king, continued to fight with relentless determination, each volley and thrust serving a calculated purpose rather than random fury. By midday, the battlefield bore testimony to the effectiveness of preparation, strategy, and leadership. French losses mounted, the mud and massed English forces making coordinated resistance nearly impossible. The field stretches with fallen banners, overturned horses, and scattered troops, the fog lifting to reveal a stunning reversal of expectations. A smaller, disciplined force overcoming a larger, overconfident army through strategy, courage, and foresight. As the day drew to its conclusion, the English army stood victorious. The miracle of Agincourt, forged in mud, arrows, and indomitable will, became a defining moment in Henry V's life and legacy. The audience sees the exhausted soldiers regrouping, Henry addressing his men, acknowledging their bravery, and surveying the battlefield with measured pride. Every individual act of courage, every tactical decision, and every ounce of discipline contributed to a victory that would echo through history. The aftermath of the battle was as significant as the combat itself. Prisoners were taken, wounded, attended to, and the army reorganized to consolidate gains. Cinematically, one witnesses the careful tending of soldiers, captured French knights escorted under guard, and Henry planning the next steps with advisors, already thinking beyond the battlefield to diplomacy, territorial gains, and the strengthening of England's position in France. The dawn after Agincourt was unlike any other. Mist clung to the scarred fields where English and French forces had clashed, leaving a silent testimony to the horror and heroism of the previous day. Cinematically, the camera pans over the uneven ground, littered with broken banners, discarded weapons, and the exhausted, mud-caked soldiers of England. Yet within this desolation lay the seeds of a legend, one that would define Henry V and shape England's place in Europe for generations. Henry rode among his men, surveying the battlefield with a steady, calculating gaze. He did not revel in carnage, nor did he underestimate the human cost of victory. Soldiers who survived, exhausted but resolute, felt the profound weight of achievement, their collective effort transforming despair into triumph. The political consequences of the battle were immediate and far-reaching. The French nobility had suffered staggering losses, not only in manpower but in morale and prestige. Cinematically, French banners lie trampled, commanders are taken prisoner, and the disarrayed remnants of their army retreat toward uncertain leadership. Henry's victory did not merely secure a tactical advantage, it destabilized French leadership, strengthened his claim, and sent ripples of fear and respect throughout the European continent. In England, news of Agincourt spread quickly, carried on horseback and through town criers. The young king, once tested by succession and political rivalries, was now celebrated as a national hero, a figure whose name inspired both pride and awe. Chroniclers would later depict Henry's leadership as divinely guided, intertwining martial skill with providential favor. Yet beyond the immediate euphoria, Henry understood the necessity of pragmatism. Prisoners were taken with care, both as bargaining chips in negotiations and to maintain discipline within his ranks. Cinematically, the scene captures captured French knights, escorted under guard, their faces a mixture of fear, defiance, and resignation, juxtaposed with the orderly English formations securing their position. Henry's attention to logistics, diplomacy, and strategy extended the battlefield's victory into tangible political leverage. Henry's relationships with his commanders and advisors deepened in the wake of battle. Leaders recount their experiences, share insights, and refine plans for continued campaigns, while Henry listens, questions, and commands with a growing mastery that belies his youth. The battlefield had tested him, but leadership beyond combat proved equally crucial. The mythic status of Agincourt began to crystallize immediately. Songs, poems, and tales circulated among soldiers and commoners alike, painting Henry as a warrior king guided by courage and divine favor. Every retelling emphasized strategy, valor, and the miraculous timing that had allowed a king to command destiny itself. England's enemies and allies alike took notice. Diplomats and foreign leaders now approached the English court with renewed caution and respect. Cinematically, shadowed chambers and ornate halls depict envoys presenting letters, gifts, and overtures, each aware that Henry's reputation as both a warrior and statesman now carried undeniable weight. Agincourt was no longer a mere battle. It was a statement of power, a turning point in the 100 Years' War, and a testament to the king's tactical brilliance. Henry's personal character was also illuminated in the aftermath. Intimate moments reveal him attending to wounded soldiers, conferring quietly with advisors, and reflecting on the human toll of the conflict. These moments reveal a leader not blinded by glory but tempered by responsibility, aware that true leadership extends beyond victory to encompass mercy, foresight, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. The king's humanity reinforced the legend, presenting him as both fierce and fair. Strategically, the victory provided leverage for subsequent campaigns and negotiations. Henry's forces were fewer in number, yet his triumph at Agincourt transformed perception into influence. Cinematically, maps and planning sessions illustrate the shifting balance of power, the recalibration of diplomacy, and the subtle art of turning battlefield success into long-term political advantage. Every decision reinforced the notion that Agincourt was not an isolated miracle, but a catalyst for broader conquest and consolidation. The miracle of Agincourt had elevated a prince to legendary status, reshaped the political landscape of France and England, and demonstrated that leadership, strategy, and courage could defy even the most daunting odds. The legend of Henry V was no longer confined to the battlefield. It permeated the collective consciousness of England and resonated across Europe. Cinematically, the closing imagery captures this duality, a battlefield scarred by conflict, yet alive with the promise of a future shaped by the vision, courage, and unwavering resolve of a king who had turned a miracle into history. The echoes of Agincourt stretched far beyond the muddy fields and fallen banners. England's position in France had been transformed, and the young king, Henry V, now carried not only the pride of victory but also the weight of expectation. Cinematically, one can visualize him standing atop a hill overlooking the camp, the morning mist dispersing to reveal a battlefield scarred yet reclaimed, his eyes scanning the horizon for the next move in a game of strategy and influence. The political ramifications were immediate and profound. French nobility, reeling from the staggering losses, were forced to reconsider alliances and reassess loyalties. Cinematically, opulent halls in Paris and Rouen host clandestine meetings where advisors whisper anxiously, letters are dispatched, and envoys cautiously navigate uncertain terrain. The humiliation at Agincourt was more than a military defeat. It was a blow to honor, prestige, and the very legitimacy of French aristocratic pride. Henry's statesmanship became as critical as his martial prowess. Cinematically, he convenes councils in England, poring over maps, corresponding with envoys, and devising treaties that leverage the battlefield victory into tangible political advantage. Negotiations for ransoms, territorial claims, and marriages were handled with precision. Prisoners of rank taken during battle became bargaining tools, each decision reinforcing England's emerging influence and Henry's growing reputation as a shrewd, capable ruler. The cultural impact of Agincourt was immediate. Songs of heroism and poems extolling the king's courage circulated among towns, villages, and the courts of Europe. Cinematically, scenes depict minstrels performing in bustling squares, chroniclers recording the events, and citizens repeating tales that blur the line between fact and legend. Henry's personal heroism became inseparable from the national narrative, the miraculous victory serving as a defining symbol of English resilience, discipline, and ingenuity. Diplomatic channels opened across the continent. Envoys from France, Burgundy, and other European powers approached with newfound respect and caution. Henry's calculated use of Agincourt's aftermath extended his influence, securing advantageous treaties and reinforcing alliances. The battlefield had become a stage for diplomacy as much as war. Back in England, the court celebrated with ceremony and reflection. Cinematically, banners flutter in the wind, heralds announce the king's deeds, and nobles gather to acknowledge his leadership. Yet Henry's focus remained on governance and preparation for the campaigns ahead. He understood that victories, however miraculous, must be consolidated with strategy, foresight, and political acumen. The discipline and courage demonstrated at Agincourt now needed to translate into sustainable power. Henry's approach to leadership, forged in the crucible of battle, combined compassion with firmness. Cinematically, intimate scenes reveal him visiting wounded soldiers, offering words of encouragement, and rewarding acts of extraordinary valor. His presence reassured allies, inspired subordinates, and deterred opponents. The king's personal engagement with both his army and his subjects created a legend grounded not only in battlefield skill, but also in humanity and vision. The consolidation of power was further cemented through strategic marriages, territorial claims, and careful administration. Cinematically, maps are unfurled, envoys arrive bearing letters, and Henry oversees the reorganization of captured lands. Every decision reinforced the narrative of a king whose authority was both legitimate and effective, whose capacity for leadership extended beyond the chaos of battle into the realm of governance, justice, and diplomacy. The psychological impact on both England and France was profound. English morale soared, citizens and soldiers alike inspired by the young king's vision and heroism. Conversely, French confidence faltered. Leaders questioned one another, and whispers of doubt spread through the courts and military camps. Agincourt's victory was not merely a moment in time, it had reshaped perceptions, recalibrated power, and redefined the balance between two nations. Henry's legacy began to solidify as more than military success. Cinematically, chroniclers record his deeds, artists capture portraits of the young king in armor, and poets immortalize his speeches and actions. The combination of courage, strategy, and statesmanship elevated Henry V from a prince to a symbol of national pride, a figure whose legend would endure long after the dust of Agincourt settled. His ability to inspire, to transform adversity into triumph, became the foundation of a mythos that intertwined personal valor with collective identity. By the end of the campaign, Henry had not only secured tactical victories, but had also ensured that England's influence in France would endure. Cinematically, the imagery lingers on the disciplined march of English forces through newly captured towns, banners waving, townspeople watching with cautious admiration, and Henry overseeing the administration of conquered territories. Every movement reinforces the narrative of a king whose leadership, courage, and strategic brilliance had transcended the battlefield to shape history itself. Cinematically, the camera pans over rolling hills, the recovered battlefield fading into memory. Henry standing atop a rise with banners fluttering behind him, surveying not only the land, but the unfolding legacy of a young monarch who had achieved the improbable. The miracle at Agincourt had transformed a prince into a legend, reshaping England's destiny and etching the name of Henry V into the annals of history as a warrior, statesman, and symbol of unyielding courage. The echoes of Agincourt were not confined to the fields of northern France. The name of Henry V carried far beyond the battlefield, resonating in the halls of kings, the minds of scholars, and the hearts of ordinary citizens. The miracle of Agincourt had become more than a military victory. It was the birth of a legend. Henry's legacy was multidimensional. He was a warrior king, a master of strategy, and a figure whose decisiveness shaped the political landscape of England and France. Cinematically, viewers see him seated at council tables, discussing treaties and territorial administration with seasoned advisors, juxtaposed with flashbacks to the muddy battlefield where arrows darkened the sky and disciplined soldiers held the line against overwhelming odds. The convergence of battlefield genius and political acumen solidified Henry as a ruler who could both fight and govern. In the years following Agincourt, Henry sought to consolidate his victories through diplomacy as much as warfare. His careful negotiation with French factions, coupled with the ransoming of captured nobles, allowed him to extend England's influence while minimizing further bloodshed. Strategy, foresight, and tact became as defining as courage in the shaping of his legend. Culturally, Henry's achievements resonated through England's collective memory. The story of a young monarch overcoming impossible odds inspired not only pride but also a sense of national identity. Agincourt became a symbol of what discipline, unity, and courage could achieve, and Henry's name was forever entwined with the concept of righteous victory. The king's influence extended beyond England. Across Europe, monarchs and noble houses regarded Henry V with respect and caution. Cinematically, courts in Paris, Burgundy, and beyond are shown in tense deliberation, advisors whispering about the remarkable success of the English king, letters carried on horseback detailing his movements, and the shifting allegiances of European powers. Henry's victories recalibrated the balance of power, demonstrating that a determined and strategically minded ruler could challenge traditional hierarchies and redefine expectations. Henry's approach to leadership combined pragmatism with inspiration. Cinematically, intimate scenes depict him reviewing camp layouts, visiting soldiers, and listening to the Council of Veterans, highlighting the human side of a monarch often romanticized for battlefield heroics. He balanced the demands of governance, military campaigns, and the cultivation of loyalty, ensuring that his kingdom remained stable and his army motivated. The legacy of Agincourt was as much about effective leadership as it was about courage under fire. The mythic quality of Henry's story grew over time. Cinematically, the narrative blends historical documentation with symbolic imagery, the king standing resolute on a hill, arrows arching across the sky, banners unfurling amidst the mist, and the English army holding firm against seemingly insurmountable odds. Chroniclers and poets celebrated the notion of divine favor, framing Henry's victories as not merely tactical, but also morally and providentially significant. This fusion of history and legend amplified his lasting influence. Henry's attention to education, culture, and the arts further enriched his legacy. His reign, though dominated by military endeavors, fostered intellectual growth and cultural sophistication in England. By blending martial prowess with patronage of learning, Henry crafted an image of a ruler who was both capable and cultivated, a combination that enhanced his enduring reputation. Even in the realm of diplomacy, Henry's impact was profound. Cinematically, envoys and ambassadors navigate the intricate web of European politics, negotiating treaties, forging alliances, and assessing the young king's reputation. His successes at Agincourt provided leverage in these interactions, creating a perception of invincibility and strategic brilliance. Henry's ability to translate battlefield achievement into political authority solidified England's position in continental affairs and elevated his personal stature across nations. This juxtaposition reinforces the complexity of his reign and the enduring resonance of his story. The influence of Henry V extended far beyond his lifetime. Cinematically, images fade into chronicles being read by successive generations, portraits adorning halls, and the story of Agincourt passed down as a moral and national exemplar. He became a symbol of courage, leadership, and the capacity for individuals to change the course of history through determination, vision, and strategic brilliance. Agincourt was not merely a battle. It was a turning point that defined a nation and immortalized a king. Henry is portrayed on a rise overlooking a quiet, rolling landscape, the battlefield now peaceful, the kingdom secured, the legend of the young king fully realized. The miracle at Agincourt had transcended the realm of military history to become a cornerstone of English identity and a testament to the enduring power of leadership, courage, and vision. The story of Henry V did not end with Agincourt or even with the campaigns that followed. Cinematically, the narrative expands to encompass England and Europe in the years after his victories, showing the ripple effects of a king whose courage, intellect, and strategic brilliance shaped a continent. The young king had become a symbol of hope, resilience, and martial genius, a living embodiment of national pride. Henry's influence endured in both tangible and intangible ways. Cinematically, we see England's fortified castles, bustling towns, and prosperous trade routes all secured through policies shaped by a ruler who understood the balance between governance and war. He consolidated power by creating networks of loyal commanders, strengthening administrative structures, and ensuring that the gains of battle translated into long-term stability. Agincourt, once a battlefield miracle, became a cornerstone of a nation's identity, and Henry's leadership was forever tied to that triumph. Agincourt became legend in English literature and folklore, a story of courage and faith under impossible odds. Minstrels sang of Henry's bravery in village squares. Poets immortalized his speeches in illuminated manuscripts. Children played games reenacting the battles, internalizing the tale of a king who led with both valor and wisdom. The legend of Agincourt would resonate for centuries, shaping how history remembered courage and leadership. Henry's diplomatic and military strategies set standards for generations of monarchs. Cinematically, envoys and ambassadors navigate the intricate politics of Europe, cautious and calculating, aware that Henry's victories had rewritten the rules of engagement. His ability to transform battlefield success into political leverage demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of power. Treaties were negotiated, territories secured, and alliances forged, all in the shadow of Agincourt, the miracle that had elevated Henry from young king to legendary figure. The king's personal character remained a subject of admiration. Cinematic sequences depict him tending to soldiers, engaging with advisors, and reflecting quietly on the cost of war. He was a ruler who understood that true leadership required more than courage. It demanded compassion, foresight, and an unwavering sense of duty. Henry's ability to inspire loyalty and discipline among his men, while balancing diplomacy and governance, created a legacy that went beyond victories to encompass the very principles of leadership itself. Even the European perspective on Henry V acknowledged his exceptional skill. Cinematically, the French court is shown in a state of tense recalibration, chroniclers writing accounts of the English king's audacity and foreign rulers weighing alliances carefully. His victories at Agincourt and subsequent campaigns had not only altered territorial boundaries, but had also shifted the perception of England as a force to be reckoned with. Henry's legend became a diplomatic asset, a story that preceded him and influenced negotiations even before he entered the room. The enduring myth of Agincourt cemented Henry's place in history. Cinematically, the battlefield is shown overgrown with grass, the echoes of arrows and marching feet fading into memory. Yet the story persists, retold in chronicles, plays, and songs, celebrated in pageantry and literature. William Shakespeare would later dramatize Henry's life and victories, immortalizing the young king for audiences centuries later. The cinematic imagery of a determined young monarch, rallying his men and achieving the impossible, resonates across generations, a timeless narrative of courage, leadership, and destiny. In reflecting on his reign, it becomes clear that Henry's legacy was not defined solely by one battle, remarkable though it was. Cinematically, we see a montage: castles fortified, armies disciplined, treaties signed, and citizens inspired. The king's ability to combine martial skill with political intelligence and cultural awareness created a model of leadership that influenced not only his contemporaries but also future generations. England emerged stronger, more cohesive, and more confident on the European stage because of the young king who had turned a miraculous victory into lasting influence. The cinematic finale emphasizes the duality of Henry's legend, the human and the heroic intertwined. We see him standing atop a rise, surveying a tranquil landscape where the battlefield once lay, banners fluttering in the wind, soldiers marching in disciplined order, and townspeople moving through daily life. The visual juxtaposition highlights the enduring impact of courage, strategy, and leadership. Henry V had not only secured a victory, but had shaped the destiny of a nation, leaving a legacy that would echo through the centuries. And as the camera pans to the horizon, the narrator concludes in cinematic, historical gravitas. Henry V, the young king who faced impossible odds, who led his men with courage and cunning, whose vision and valor reshaped nations. His story is not merely a tale of battle. It is a testament to the power of leadership, the endurance of legend, and the capacity of one individual to change the course of history. If you have been inspired by this journey through courage, strategy, and the miracle at Agincourt, like, share, and subscribe, so that history's greatest stories continue to live, to inspire, and to remind us that the past is never truly gone. It waits for those willing to witness it. The story of Henry V concludes, yet the legend lives on, a cinematic testament to bravery, wisdom, and the making of a king whose name will forever be etched in the annals of history.